Hi, welcome. This is Dr. John DeMartini. This is one of the most amazing and inspiring shows that you can listen into. If you want to be on the edge of your seats, if you want to open up your heart, if you want to expand your mind, and you want to meet incredible people, stay tuned because you're just about to experience a transformative radio show that will change your life. And you're listening to the Dr. Pat Show that's coming up right next.
The following audio is via a Skype call.
Welcome to the Dr. Pat Show. Talk radio to thrive by. Powerful, inspiring, and coming to you live, bringing you stories of people like you and me, busting through and living life full out. Get ready to dare to wonder what your life would be like if you knew you could not fail.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. You're listening, to the Dr. Pat Show. This is Talk Radio to Thrive By. You're also listening to us on a number of different networks, but one of them, of course, is Transformation Talk Radio. You're also listening from Seattle on one of our super affiliates, AM 1150. And for those
super
of you out
affiliates?
Yeah,
wow,
like
I like that.
flagship.
Not just your average affiliate. We've got a super affiliate.
You're like
All
at the hub.
We just stepped it up.
You're like a hubber. Like it's a
just like I said. All right, it's like a super, not like a weather cell, but a super cell.
No, you're like the super.
Wow.
Right.
Now I got
you know what I'm
something to
saying?
live up to today. Yeah, right.
It
I
is
know
a
what you're
big-
saying. I know
I'll
what you're
tell
saying.
you.
Yeah.
Benny, it's like a super thing to live up to for sure. Totally. Absolutely. There's no question about it.
Love it.
But it's really true. I mean, almost every show of the Dr. Pat Show begins in this hub. So you are the focal point. You're in the vortex. You're like the thing that generates the thing, and then the other thing, and then the other thing, like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Like I said, those are some big shoes to fill. I don't know. I might just stay with super.
Yeah.
Cell,
I mean, you're almost better than White Castle hamburgers, but I'm not sure.
I've never had those. I know. Okay, so wherever you can find them, if they're fresh, send them to me. I want to try them.
I don't think they live here. I mean, I'm not even sure if they.
They do in frozen fresh version.
Oh, but do they? I think they still are in the Bronx where I was born.
Actually, I said frozen fresh. What's that supposed
Did you
to
say frozen fresh? Did you say that? Oh my God!
Well,
now you're
technically,
talking
I guess
about,
they are, but
I think you're talking about salmon though, because we get frozen fresh salmon.
Yep.
Oh, I have a box coming to me.
Do you really?
My buddy is a fisher boat person.
A boat person?
Fisher boat person, like the boats that go out and actually catch fish.
Commercial, yes, I did that for a few years in Alaska. Yes, I did.
And just so you know, they freeze everything right there.
Yeah, well, they have to. They got to get down here.
I buy them by the box.
That's what you're supposed to do. Or if you go up there and fish it like yourself, you just bring it on the plane with you.
Should I even announce how much I pay for them? No. I'm not going to do that. That's not fair. It's not fair because everybody's going to be like going to the store.
I know.
And they were like, oh, wait a minute. Why is that $18 a pound?
There you go.
But I think I'm going to let Brian talk about all this.
Perfect.
Dr. Brian Wilson's joining us here today. He's probably thinking, really? Who scheduled me for these two? Listen, Benny, I'm so glad you went off and got well rested, getting geared up as we're get ready to come into the holiday season here. Yeah. Here's what I love about this. So Linda is my producer. You're my producer engineer, but Linda is the brainchild behind who I get to talk with. She's also my best friend since 1973. And so when this book came across the desk, I looked at it and I said, okay, there's no question about it. I have got to have a conversation with somebody that has done this type of thorough investigation and writing about a gentleman. I just want to say a gentleman, John E. Fetzer. The book is called John E. Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. Dr. Brian C. Wilson, joining us here today, is the author of the book. He's also a professor at the American Religious History, a professor of American Religious History and Department of Comparative Religion at Western Michigan University, WMU. And he has written this incredible book. However, it's not his first book. He's also written award-winning books. But more importantly, He's somebody that is bringing a conversation to the forefront because there aren't many people that are willing to even use the phrase New Age anymore. And when I got this book, I thought, okay, I'm going to read it. And when I opened it up and I saw what Dr. Wilson put in to this beautifully written research, we got to love us researchers, robust book, I thought to myself, there is the missing link. He has covered it. We've got it in the book. So we're not only going to talk about evolution today and the evolution of John Fetzer's beliefs, but we're going to talk about how you take beliefs and create and manifest and put them into action. Because one of the things that you guys have heard me talk about in the context of the New Age is it is the now age. Dr. Wilson, great to have you here. Great to have you.
Great to be with you.
I hope you didn't hang up after Benny and I were talking.
No, you're making me hungry with the White Castle burgers.
Oh, my God.
With a side of salmon.
Yeah, that's right.
Salmon. Yeah. Well, growing up in New York, right? I grew up in the Bronx, and when people say, let's go out to dinner, we went for a 12-cent White Castle hamburger.
Yeah. Can't beat him.
But I wonder if John Fetzer did the same thing. What do you think?
He was one who loved his hamburgers, actually.
Yep.
He was an aficionado of Burger King burgers.
Yes. So let's start with I want to start with kind of an interesting question for you, because this is more about you than it is about he. I think each of us have been touched on the shoulder by somebody in our lifetime or previous lifetimes. I want to know from you, what was it about Fetzer? What was it about John? What was it about his life? And I guess the question that I'm asking is kind of interesting because, I mean, you could be, Fetzer incarnate, so to speak. But what, if any, specific thing got your attention?
Wow. Well, there was a lot about John Fetzer that really interested me. My specialty is American religious history, but I really look at new religious movements and new religious and spiritual movements, and I'm fascinated with how individuals basically create their worldviews. And in most cases, it's a completely kind of unconscious process that people don't even think about too much. And so for me to have the kinds of materials necessary to actually do a kind of rich reconstruction of somebody's worldview is fairly rare. So I found this with my last subject, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, who left behind this huge paper trail. So it was fun because I was able to really look in detail on how he constructed his worldview and how it evolved over time. And the same thing with John Fetzer. There are materials in the Fetzer Institute archives that go all the way back to his childhood. And so for me, one of the attractions here was here was somebody's spiritual evolution that I could really reconstruct in detail and really kind of understand him from the inside out. And so that was one of the major attractions to doing this book.
I want to ask you this question. I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but you can't say that I didn't tell you I wouldn't. What was it about your research and discovery? Because you did a ton of research, and I know one researcher to another. I studied the consequence of broken promises for 8 years, so I understand what research is. But you really have done research. What did you find in your research about John that you were pleasantly surprised about? And then the flip side of that, what did you find where you thought, did he really do that? Well, bad boy, good boy.
Well, the thing that really impressed me with John Fetzer was that he was born and raised a Christian. He was baptized a Methodist, And then his mother joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church when he was a teenager. So he followed his mother into the church. And he was a very kind of devout Adventist for many years until his late 20s. And then he decided, this really isn't fulfilling me spiritually. So he left the church, and at that point started to investigate all sorts of metaphysical and spiritual traditions out there. And what really impressed me with John Fetzer was just how open he was to exploring just about, everything out there. And of course, that was fun for me because I then had to go back and basically study each of the traditions he was into, like Theosophy and Rosicrucianism and Hermeticism and all these kinds of things, New Thought. So for me, it was great because his openness really kind of opened up for me an opportunity to explore all these different things. Some of the things that surprised me, he was very interested in various forms of divination. And this goes all the way back to his, when he left the Seventh-day Adventist Church, he went down to, he was living at that time in Kalamazoo, and he went down to Indiana to a place called Camp Chesterfield, which is a spiritualist camp. And it's still in business today. They're a thriving institution, and it's kind of like a permanent psychic fair. And so he went down there in 1933 and started going to seances and having readings by psychics and that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So he also encountered there a variety of different forms of divination. For example, astrology, tarot cards, all those kinds of things. But the two things he adopted, which surprised me, were the pendulum. He always carried around a pendulum in his pocket, and it was just simply a lead weight on the end of a string. And when he had decisions to make, and they could be personal, they could be business, they could be just about anything that he had doubts about, he would pull out the pendulum and basically ask it questions, yes/no questions. And he believed that the deflection of the pendulum would guide him to make a correct decision. So that surprised me. And he was also, he loved using the Ouija board.
Yes.
And that was just quite remarkable because, I always thought of the Ouija board as a toy that basically kids play with and, and scare themselves with. But he used it as a real tool, and he believed that he had actually gotten some really good results out of it. He would ask it, questions about business decisions and personal decisions, but he also used it to trace his past lives because he was a fervent believer in reincarnation and believed he had gone through multiple past lives. So that surprised me. I had no idea that people actually used Ouija boards in that kind of serious way.
Yeah, this is before we went all Hollywood with them, right? And so I want to just take a minute. Oh my God, Benny, let's go ahead and skip the break if we could. I want to take a minute and describe to our listeners who John Fetzer was in the outside world. I want to take a minute because you and I are talking about some things that there's a large population of people would not associate with highly successful and wealthy people, right? Right. And I want to put this in context, if we could, for the rest of the show.
Sure.
Let's talk about who this man is and what he achieved in the material world.
Yeah, he was a radio pioneer. He was first introduced to radio by his brother-in-law, a guy named Fred Ribble, who was a telegrapher on the Wabash Railroad. And together, around about 1911 or 1912, they put together a really kind of primitive crystal set radio, and it just blew John Fetzer away, and he knew he basically had his life's work. And so from there, he managed to build a radio station at his college, and the college turned around after a while and sold him the license to the radio station. So he moved it to Kalamazoo and created WKZO, which was one of the first commercial radio stations in Southwest Michigan. And from there, he got into FM radio, he got into television, he was a pioneer in cable, he also got into music and recording, and just made a fortune by building this media empire. Here in Michigan, people who know about John Fetzer know about him because he was also the longtime owner of the Detroit Tigers baseball team. He managed to put together an 11-man syndicate in 1956, and they bought the Tigers, and I forget exactly how much they paid for it, something like $5 million. And over a few years, until 1961, he basically bought out all the other owners, and he became the sole owner of the ball team. And he ran it until the early 80s when he finally sold it, and sold it for about $50 million. So he made a pretty tidy profit off of it. But he loved the baseball team. He loved running the baseball team. So by the time he died, he was listed as one of the 400 wealthiest people in the United States by Forbes magazine. So an incredibly, incredibly successful businessman.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that because now we've set the stage and the context for what we're about to talk about. In the book that you wrote, right, Johnny Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age, right? In this book, I want to also tell people that we're not talking about somebody that, a decade ago. We're going back in time for a little bit. And I just also want to put that in place, too. Yeah. So we're talking about his presence, right? Post World War II, 1945, 1949, whatever that is. We're really talking about sort of the generation of the John Fetzer energy back in that era, too. Right, Brian? Dr. Wilson? Yeah.
Yeah, he was born in 1901 and he died in 1991. So he lived, he was almost 90 years old. So his life really spans the 20th century. And his story is fascinating because, he's a good example of a kind of self-made businessman. But his spiritual search, which he did in parallel to his business, is also kind of a record of a really unique spiritual search that, well, it wasn't unique because other people during the time were doing it as well, even in the Midwest. And that's one of the things I like to stress in the book is that John Fetzer was into all this stuff, but the only way he could be was if he could find it locally. And so there was really a very interesting kind of metaphysical and spiritual underground in the Midwest during most of his life. And he tapped into that. And it was huge. I'm originally from California, so I always thought growing up that California was the place where all this stuff started.
Right.
And it turns out, no.
Right.
The Midwest, a lot of that stuff came out of the Midwest. And so that was, for me, as a scholar of new religious movements and spiritual movements, that was a fascinating aspect of this book.
Well, I mean, it is a fascinating aspect. And part of this, too, is, boy, you've done a beautiful job, really, of taking us on this journey. Oh my gosh, I found this so interesting in reading it. And of course, I've got to go back and read it because in getting ready for the show, I mean, I couldn't really stop and say, well, wait a minute, let me just look at this a little bit closer. But I want to kind of hop out of the gate with the conversation about meeting Jesus in the elevator.
Yes.
And I want to talk about that because he and I both had very interesting Jesus experience when we were younger. But I love that story. I mean, certainly meeting Jesus in the elevator got my attention, right?
Well, this was back when he was a child in a small Indiana town, and he went to the local department store, a place called Shortell's, and as kids, are like to do, he was fooling around in the elevator, playing in the elevator. And apparently at some point it got stuck or something happened. And he felt he was trapped. And then all of a sudden he looked up and he had a vision of Jesus. And he found himself holding on to Jesus's leg. And Jesus said to him, I'll never let go of you. And so for him, and he's recounting this actually at the end of his life in his 80s. So this was a tremendously formative experience that just impressed him with kind of, the availability of spirit, even in a department store elevator, here it was. So that was a tremendously formative experience for John Fetzer.
Yeah. Did John know, I don't know if you know the answer to this. Did John know that he was in the middle of this movement that we look back at now and call the New Age? Did he know he was in this?
Well, no, although
Yeah.
he called himself a New Ager and used the term himself, but that was beginning in the 1960s.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And so when the New Age movement really became prominent in the United States in the 80s and early 90s, he was already ahead of the wave. He had already for 20 years been talking about the New Age and calling himself a New Ager. And there's a lot in common with his spiritual worldview and the worldview that eventually became identified as New Age. Now, you mentioned earlier, which is interesting, a lot of people today don't want to be called New Agers. They shy away from the idea of New Age. And I think this is something I discuss at the end of the book, is that today people associate the New Age or the New Age movement with a kind of hyper-individualistic, over-commercialized, narcissistic kind of self-spirituality. And one of the things that John Fetzer really emphasized was that, individual spiritual transformation is important, but he hoped that if enough people on the planet basically underwent this spiritual transformation, it would lead to a global transformation. Mm-hmm. And that's the New Age. The New Age is a global phenomenon. It's not an individual one. So for him, there was always this social component to his spiritual quest.
Yeah. One of the things, too, that I was really struck by in the book was almost this sense of relentlessness in this quest, in this journey. Do you know, is that a good word, or did I use it?
No, tenacious, relentless. I think
tenacious,
you're exactly right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you a sort of a not so researchy question, but an opinionated question. What do you think was going on inside of him that literally, not inspired, that's not the word, but just wouldn't let go of him in this journey? Because that's my sense of him, especially now after reading the book.
Well, I think the kind of fundamental aspect of the worldview is this kind of monistic view of the cosmos, that everything is spirit. And he believed that there was a great central source that basically emanated spirit. And since he was a radio engineer, he always thought of in terms of the metaphor of energy. So he's always talking about energy or spiritual energy. And sometimes he would talk about God occasionally, but he would also talk about the father of radiation. And what he meant by that was spiritual radiation, spiritual energy. And for him, I think this was compelling because it explained a lot, but it also helped him reconcile science and spirituality, which for him was a lifelong goal. He always wanted to come up with ways that would harmonize science and spirituality, because ultimately he believed that one of the kind of harbingers of the New Age, if you will, was when science became spiritualized, when there was a harmony between science and spirituality. So I think his quest was to basically prove to himself and to the world that science and spirituality are basically two sides of the same coin. And I think that provides some of the drive, some of the tenaciousness, because that's why he was looking at everything to come up with elements and to put together for his worldview, all in the quest to basically prove to the reality of spirit at some level.
Oh, and that leads me to the next question. I love that you talked about the I am religious activity in the book. I am. And I want to say that word because now we're seeing the use, very, very similar use of the word I am, not just in the New Thought arena anymore, but also in sort of this progressive movement in Christianity to move away from religion and talk spirituality. And by the way, the person that comes to mind is Joel Osteen around this right now from a Christian contingency, and even Joyce Meyer when I think about that. But this language, this I am language, especially when I think about the dates of the references you make in the book, 1934, 1935, 1938, Bill Wilson, the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, Ernest Holmes, Emma Curtis Hopkins. And now we're talking about these people. So can you talk about, from your perspective and research, who are the most influential people or the most influential writings for John?
Well, I think there were a number. He was really fascinated by theosophy of all kinds.
Mm-hmm.
And theosophy, of course, it began in the United States. It was a 19th century movement that basically brought together Western esotericism with Hinduism and Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's where he actually got his belief in reincarnation and the power of karma. Mm-hmm. So I think theosophy was tremendously important. And within the theosophical kind of orbit, there's the I Am Religious activity, which was based in Chicago. And what's really interesting there is that the theosophy basically believes that there are people who can channel higher beings or ascended masters, and that there are these higher beings out there that can basically provide us with guidance in our spiritual evolution. And that's another key idea in theosophy is human spiritual evolution. Mm-hmm. So the I Am Religious activity was based on these kinds of ideas as well. He was also very interested in Alice Bailey and the Arcane School.
Yeah.
He loved the Great Invocation.
Yes.
And he had that printed in one of his genealogies, and he also he had spiritual groups when he was older, study groups, and they would always begin by reciting the Great Invocation. So I think these were tremendously important. And then in New Thought, there are a number of figures that were important, even including, of course, Ralph Waldo Trine in Tune with the Infinite, Ernest Holmes, and Norman Vincent Peale, of course, the big 1950s kind of Christianized New Thought guy. Mm-hmm. So these were very important for him too. The idea that the mind had power over matter was a tremendously important idea for him. And even before he practiced meditation, he practiced affirmations. And of course, that goes right back to the New Thought movement.
Mm. Well, I mean, I just want to say to folks, if you want to find out more about what the Great Invocation is, you can certainly Google it and it'll take you there. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we have copies of this book to give away. And more importantly, what is it looking like now as we put ourselves in the shoes of John Fetzer in the year 2018? What would it look like from Dr. Brian Wilson's perspective if John were here now and looking back? What might he say, and would he revise his vision? Let's take a short break. We're going to have so much fun. We'll be right back.
Are you done being afraid to jump into the life that's waiting for you? Are you ready for a real shift? I invite you to tune in every Tuesday with me, Tracy L., on the Tracy L. Clark Show, where we will teach you how to live your extraordinary life. At 8 a.m. Pacific on Transformation Talk Radio, where I will provide the tools and the steps needed to help you transcend perceived limitations and move forward with an extraordinary life. For more information, visit me at tracylclark.com.
Golden Otter Divinations Radio, where the metaphysical meets the mainstream with Autumn Seibel. Tune in the first Friday every month at 9 a.m. Pacific as Autumn, educator, health coach, and medium, explores metaphysical and mainstream strategies on how to elevate your level of conscious living. Draw in the abundance that is yours by divine right. For more information about working with Autumn, visit goldenotter.us. That's golden like the precious metal and otter like the precious animal.us.
Tune in to E3 Influence Radio. Own your impact. Master your world. In this new hit show, Sarah Luce, empowerment coach and spiritual mentor, teaches us how to achieve our greatest potential to positively affect everything and everyone. The time is now to enlighten our minds, empower our hearts, and take energized action to raise the consciousness of our planet. Sarah shows us how with simple, easy-to-implement steps. To find out more about Sarah Luce and her E3 Influence program, visit sarahluce.com.
What is holding you back from living the life you are meant to live? Why is it vital to believe in something bigger than yourself? Are you in physical or emotional pain? Tune in monthly to Vibrant Purposeful Living. Awaken the vibrant life within you with Lou Paradise and Dr. Pat on TransformationTalkRadio.com. Lou's passion is to help everyone experience positive solutions for life. Find out more about Lou with Vibrant Purposeful Living at LouParadise.com.
Tune in to Knowledge Book Radio with host Marge Potasic each Tuesday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern on TransformationTalkRadio.com. Through many experiences, Marge was led to the Knowledge Book, a gift to humanity in its transition to the Golden Age, and it provided the truth and the answers. She now shares information from the Knowledge Book with you each week on TransformationTalkRadio.com. For more information, visit usa.theknowledgebook.net.
Do you believe you are meant to live with more joy, but you're just not sure how to get it? What does the phrase, "give me the joy," make you feel? Join me, Lynn Horde, every second and fourth Thursday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern, on the Gimme the Joy Show, as I take you on a journey to peel back the layers so you can take back your joy. To find out more about my work as the Joy Coach, including my popular programs Joy School and Joy at Work, visit lynnhorde.com.
Wow. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Look, we are going to give a couple of copies away of Dr. Brian Wilson's book. And the book is called John E. Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. I love this book for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is that I have been on my own spiritual journey and trying to make sense of things for most of my life. And to really read in such detail what it was like to see a very successful individual be part of the same quest that many of you are on, right? You know, it's interesting to really have a book in hand like this, Dr. Wilson, and realize you're not alone. But before we get to that, I'd love to find out, how can folks get a copy of the book and how can they find out more about you?
Well, the book is it was published by Wayne State University Press, and it's available on Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble, of course. And it's been published as a hardback and also an ebook. So if you want to get it for Kindle, you can.
Oh, yeah.
Now, there's the Fetzer Institute basically commissioned this project. And they have a branch called the Memorial Trust, which is basically in charge with preserving the legacy of John Fetzer. And they have a website called infinitepotential.com. And if you go there, you can find out about the Memorial Trust and the Fetzer Institute in general. And you can also download a free PDF of the preface and first chapter of the book. So if you're interested in just getting a little teaser, that's available there. And then if you're interested in learning more about the Fetzer Institute in general, all you have to do is go to Fetzer, FETZER.org. And there you'll find descriptions of the various kinds of spiritual programs that the Fetzer Institute's doing today.
I would encourage everybody go check out Infinite Potential, the website, because first of all, I think it's very important that we're all coming together to share ideas, and www.infinitepotential.com is a great place to start, as well as some of the other places Dr. Wilson talked about. Benny, let's go ahead and give a copy of the book away, if we could. 1-800-930-2819. 1-800-930-2819. Dr. Wilson, before the break, I said, I wonder what John Fetzer would be thinking if he were here on the show with us today, and kind of be looking back at his own personal journey and sort of the evolution of things. And one of the things that comes to mind is, given the evolution that we're talking about, are we any clearer on where we are and what we believe? Or are we kind of more confused than ever? And the reason I bring this up is because we went from people really holding their head up high about being part of the New Age movement to almost being at a place where you can't find the term anymore.
Right. Well, I think for John Fetzer, he was always a tremendously optimistic person. So I think even looking back, he would still think that we've made some progress. Now it's incremental and it's small, but I think he would think that we are making some progress. On the other hand, he was always very concerned about, for example, what was happening in the United States. He was always a very fervent patriot and thought the United States had a big role to play in the ultimate spiritual transformation of the world. And so when he was writing in the 1960s, he was addressing the kinds of divisive issues that were a problem during that period. And he suggested spiritual solutions to them. And today, I think if you were alive and looking at the country now and how we're just so divided, and it's so very difficult for us to talk to our neighbors if they happen to be on the other side of the political fence, I think he would be dismayed by it. But on the other hand, I think he would still think that if you pursue spiritual solutions to the problems, then we can overcome this and basically move forward. One of the interesting things is towards the end of his life, he basically liquidated his businesses, sold everything off, and used the proceeds to create a foundation. And the foundation is called the Fetzer Institute. And it's still thriving today, and its mission has evolved over the years. But one of the programs they're doing right now is looking at the kind of spiritual roots of democracy and getting groups of people together of a variety of different ideologies and opinions, all to talk about kind of the spiritual roots of democracy as hopefully an effort to get people to start talking with each other instead of shouting at each other. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that John Fetzer would think would be called for, considering the state of the country right now. So I think he'd be dismayed. Yeah. I think he would have thought we could have made more progress in the almost 30 years since he's been gone. But I think he was always very realistic about human failings, but also very optimistic about human potential. So I think he would have thought that we were still making progress, even though that progress seemed very limited.
How would you describe the method, if I could use that term, or the way that he integrated his beliefs into his everyday life?
Well, for example, he really believed that he had really good business instincts, business intuition, and he believed that his ability to make generally pretty good business decisions, and especially to surround himself with good people who were loyal and helpful, was due to a kind of extrasensory perception. He really thought of his business instincts, his intuition, as being almost psychic in nature. And so I think that helped him trust his instinct because he believed in the reality of the psychic world. So that was very important. But the interesting thing about John Fetzer was that he was always very careful to kind of compartmentalize his business life from his spiritual life until his last decades. And I think the reason for that was he was always very private, I think, a private person. Yeah. But he had business considerations as well, because in West Michigan, which tends to be pretty conservative religiously, he was always afraid that he was going to be misunderstood and that he might lose advertisers and audience members if they knew the kinds of things he was interested in. So it became second nature for him to be very private about his spiritual development. And that is until the 1970s, when he decided to basically sell off his companies and basically create his foundation. At that point, he became much more open about his spiritual journey until the last decade, in which he was almost completely open about it. So there was an interesting kind of evolution in terms of his spiritual journey, in terms of just how willing he was to basically let the world know that this is what he was into.
I have a different question for you, because I've often thought of my own spiritual journey, and I've often thought of, okay, if I were alive during the time he were alive, who would be the people I would reach out to sit down with and have coffee or tea or something with? Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you, who were those people? Were there people that he said, I really need an audience with this, 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 and this? Now, I know that there are a lot of years we're talking about, but I can only imagine, as the evolution that he had going on within, he sought people on the outside.
Well, he did. In terms of his spiritual journey, he was always interested in identifying people who he believed were genuinely psychic. And so during the 1960s, he was great friends with Jean Dixon and consulted her quite a bit. He took a trip in the 1970s to basically investigate parapsychological research in Europe. And one of the people he ran into was a psychic named Ina Twigg, who was quite well known in her day. And she, in fact, was the one who basically suggested he use the Ouija board to trace his past lives. So he was always reliant on psychics. He was always reliant on channelers. And those were the kinds of people that he would really kind of open up to in terms of his spiritual journey. Although he always had a circle of good friends that formed a kind of club, if you will, or study group. So in the 1970s, he got very interested in A Course in Miracles. He was one of the first people to read these channelings. So he brought together a group of people in Kalamazoo who he knew and trusted, and they basically spent years studying A Course in Miracles. So there were a number of major kind of figures in the psychic world that he was interested in meeting. And of course, he was always meeting, in terms of just famous people, in terms of pro sports and politics and business, all sorts of interesting folks. But in terms of his spiritual life, it really were kind of spiritual advisors and channelers. And in fact, in his last decade, he came to know a channeler from Texas named Jim Gordon, who he was very impressed with, and essentially became kind of his house channeler, his house psychic for the last 10 years of his life. And so this was somebody he trusted implicitly and found just tremendously helpful, not only in his own spiritual search, but also setting the mission of the Fetzer Institute.
And let's talk about that for a minute, because, at some point in time, we discover that he's not only just out in the world doing all the things that we're talking about, but, he is now, I'm going to build for the new age. I'm going to build something. I'm going to create something. And let's talk about the foundation for a minute, because it wasn't just about, this is my life, this is what I believe, but it's about, what's the legacy going to be about? Can we talk a little bit about what his intention was, vision was, and how it came to be?
Yeah, well, part of it was he made a tremendous amount of money in his lifetime, but I think he was always a little bit uncomfortable about how rich he became. Because he himself lived a very modest lifestyle. I mean, there were no chauffeured limousines or private jets or any of that kind of stuff. Lived in a very modest home here in Kalamazoo. So I think for him, the money making was fun, but it wasn't the end. It wasn't the goal. And the goal ultimately had to have some spiritual purpose. And so I think for a long time he was thinking about, how can I use my money to basically, and he always talked about money as energy to do work in the world.
Yep, that's right.
And so how can I use my money to basically catalyze the kind of global spiritual transformation that I think is going to happen? And so at the end of his life, well, in the 1970s, when he was in his 70s, he began kind of laying the groundwork to basically fund up his foundation. Now, the foundation was created in the 1950s, but he really didn't do much with it until the 1970s. And that's when he started selling off his businesses and actually had the money to really invest in all sorts of interesting programs and research. And this foundation would eventually, of course, become the Fetzer Institute. And he knew he wasn't going to live to see the New Age. He knew that this was going to be a long-term proposition, but he felt if he could embody his vision in a stable institution, then that would essentially be his legacy. And so the Fetzer Institute's mission was kind of twofold. One was to encourage individual spiritual transformation in hopes of basically catalyzing the global spiritual transformation, but it was also to fund cutting-edge science, to look at the interface between science and spirituality. And to some degree, those two missions have continued with the Fetzer Institute to the present day.
And this really leads to the shift that he made, because I think early on, right, he was really focused on the paranormal, but in this later stage, he really tapped into energy medicine. I think before energy medicine was mentioned on Dr. Oz's show here. But let's talk a little bit about energy medicine, because if you go back in time and you look at what he did here, there weren't really a whole lot of people talking about this, let alone funding it, were there?
No, he was a pioneer in this. During the 1970s, he was really interested in parapsychological research. So he was funding up, programs in ESP and clairvoyance and psychokinesis and things like that. And then he grew kind of dissatisfied with the pace of research. And his health also was beginning to fail at the end of the 70s. So he started changing his focus away from that towards alternative medicine, holistic health. And within that, the thing that really fascinated him was the potential of using the human aura, the kind of energy transmissions of the body, of coming up with a technology that could actually detect and measure this in order to basically diagnose and treat disease. So he entered into a partnership with the ARE Clinic, the Association for Research and Enlightenment Clinic, and this is part of the Edgar Cayce organization, and it's in Arizona. And together, they were going to pioneer the creation of new technologies to basically do this kind of energy medicine. They made some progress, and in fact, there was a global energy medicine conference that Fetzer basically underwrote in 1989, and it took place in Madras, India. And it's really, some people cite it as the beginning of energy medicine research, serious energy medicine research in the world. So it had a tremendous impact. Although after John Fetzer died in 1991, the Fetzer Institute decided to go in different directions, away from energy medicine research and more towards kind of more mainstream holistic health research and education.
One of the things I think I'm curious about, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, I often think about, he has such a rich and fulfilling life, right? Did so many things, so many influences. Was there something at the time of his passing that he wished he would have done more of, or maybe something he would have not done? I know, right?
Yeah, because the interesting thing is at a certain point, he basically thought, okay, the foundation is on an even keel. And so I can let it run of itself. And he basically moved away from Kalamazoo and went to Hawaii to spend the last 18 months or so of his life. So he was very confident that the Fetzer Institute was going to accomplish what he wanted it to accomplish. It's hard to say. He had a wonderful relationship with his wife, Rhea, who he married in 1926, and she died in, I think, 86.
Yeah.
So it was a long, very fulfilling marriage, and a marriage of equals too, because in the early days he was off in Washington D.C. trying to get certain legislation passed so he could expand his radio business, and his wife Rhea basically ran the radio, so she's a real important part of his success. So in his home life, I think he was very fulfilled, and his spiritual life basically eventuated in the Fetzer Institute. And of course, in terms of business, he was a tremendous success. So I'm not sure. I think he was very satisfied. In fact, he basically said that, this is my last incarnation here on Earth. I've gone through multiple reincarnations, multiple past lives, all leading up to this point. I've gotten the wisdom and the knowledge from these past lives, and now I can actually apply it. And he was very confident that this was it. He would ascend to a higher plane of consciousness and continue his journey, in the afterlife, but he wouldn't be coming back. So I think that's pretty, if we could all say that on our deathbed, I think we'd all be pretty satisfied.
I have a question for you. If he was sitting here with us, I wonder, what would you like to ask him?
Well, one of the things that it intrigues me is that he had a very powerful mystical experience as a child, and the Jesus in the elevator experience. But later, he basically did not. And at one point, he even tried LSD as a possible way of having a mystical experience, which was not a very good experience for him. He never did it again. So I'm curious why he thought, here was a tremendously spiritual person who obviously had the capacity for mystical experience, but that was something, maybe getting back to your previous question, I guess that was something maybe that he may have regretted, was that he didn't have a more rich, kind of mystical life in that sense. He was very intellectual. Most of his spiritual search was very, in the mind, essentially.
Yeah, cognitive.
Cognitive, that's what I'm looking for. And he was always searching for religious experience through practices like transcendental meditation, and then he got into Surya Shabd Yoga, a type of Radhaswami meditation during his 80s, which he found fulfilling. But I don't think he really had the kind of dazzling mystical experience that he was hoping for. So I'd ask him about that.
Yeah. I mean, and it's so interesting you mentioned that, because, part of this too is really looking at the evolution of his own personal journey, but then also, on the show today and out in the world, there's so many people that, you're looking at some of the changes that people are making individually and organizations are making, and the evolution continues, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I have a friend of mine that is baffled by the latest decision that the Pope made, where he changed the catechism, changed the word in the catechism, but it's a big word. And the bottom line to that is, look, if we're going to be pro-life, we're going to be pro-life. And what the Pope is saying, you cannot be pro-life for abortion rates and then be pro-death for people that commit crimes. I mean, I think he changed like a word or two, but it changed that. Many people don't even know that even happened. But I think we are talking about the evolution of things and the really exploration of beliefs that we once had that are up for reconsideration.
Yeah. Well, I think that's key. Always to keep an open mind and always know that what you have is not the final end product.
Right.
If this life is simply a continuum of past lives and future lives, then it's really presumptuous of us to think that we actually know anything for absolute sure.
Yeah.
And so I think you always, in a spiritual search, it's a cliche, but it's the journey, not the destination, that's important.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for joining us here today. And I have one last question for you. What is your personal message? What would you like to leave us with? And again, tell us how we can get a copy of the book and how we can find out more. And thank you for today.
My pleasure. It's been great. Well, I mean, if there's any larger message in the book, Johnny Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age, it's the importance of keeping yourself open to spiritual experience and spiritual exploration. That's what kept John Fetzer going and kept him young, even into his late 80s. So I think that's the message I'd like to relay. The book, you can get copies of the book on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com and other online booksellers. And again, if you're interested in downloading a free PDF of the preface and the first chapter, you can go to infinitepotential.com.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you.
My
Dr.
pleasure.
Brian Wilson, everybody. A book is really just loaded with information, and I found it fascinating, absolutely fascinating, Dr. Wilson. So thank you for doing it. It's a body of work, boy.
Thank you.
Wow. Benny, thank you for pushing all of the right buttons as usual. I want to thank all of you, the best listeners on the planet. I want to thank you for being absolutely amazing. And thank you for tuning us in, turning us on. If you've missed any part of this, go ahead and go to transformationtalkradio.com or the Dr. Pat Show, and we'll see you next time.
The preceding audio was via a Skype call.